Evelyn Carter burned the letter 3 times before she finally let it stay whole. It was an invitation to Whitmore Estate, to a man so rich and so cold, the whole county whispered his name like a warning. She knew what she was being sent there to be. Not a bride, a shadow. Something plain, standing next to something perfect, so the perfect thing would shine brighter. She pressed her hand flat against the scorched paper and made herself a promise no one else in that house was ever going to hear her make. If you're new here, subscribe and stay until the very end. This story will surprise you. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. The morning Evelyn Carter received the second letter, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a needle and thread, mending the same blue dress she'd already mended twice that season. The stitches on the left sleeve had gone thin again. She worked slowly because the thread had to last. Her father came in from outside without knocking his boots clean, which meant something had already gone wrong before he opened the door. "Evelyn," he said, just her name, nothing after it. She looked up. Thomas Carter was not a man who scared easily. He had farmed that land in Harlan County through drought and flood, and a winter so bad 2 of the horses didn't make it to spring. But the look on his face right then was the look of a man who had run out of road. He set the paper on the table between them. The seal on it was already broken. She didn't touch it right away. "The Whitmore letter?" she asked. "The bank letter," he said. "The Whitmore letter came yesterday. I didn't show you because I was still thinking." "How much?" He sat down. "Enough." She picked up the bank letter and read it, twice. Then she set it back down, aligned with the edge of the table, the way her mother used to do with things that frightened her, made them neat, made them manageable. Pretended that straightening paper was the same as solving the problem written on it. The number was not a surprise. She'd known the direction they were heading for 2 years. What surprised her was how final the language was. Final notice. Property foreclosure. 60 days. 60 days. She picked up the Whitmore letter next. It was written in a secretary's hand, formal, clean, the kind of penmanship that cost money to learn. It informed Miss Evelyn Carter that she had been selected along with several other young women of the county to visit Whitmore Estate for a period of 3 weeks as a guest of the household. Transportation would be provided. All expenses would be covered. It was signed by a Mrs. Harriet Beaumont on behalf of the Whitmore family. Evelyn read it twice, too. Then she set it beside the bank letter and looked at both of them sitting there together. "Who else got invited?" she said. Her father pulled at the skin on his knuckles. "The Beaumont girl, 3 of the Hargrove cousins, young Sarah Pennington from up near Lexington. A few more I don't know." "Clara Beaumont," Evelyn said. "Yes." She folded her hands on the table. "And it was Mrs. Beaumont who sent the invitations." Her father didn't answer. "Papa?" Her voice was quiet. "It was Clara's mother who arranged this entire thing. That's what people are saying." She thought about Clara Beaumont. She'd seen her twice in town, once at the dry goods store, once at Sunday service. Clara was the kind of beautiful that made other women in a room feel slightly less than what they were. Pale and deliberately dressed, with a laugh that managed to sound both polite and exclusive at once. She was 23 years old and had been groomed her entire life to marry exactly this kind of man. And her mother had decided, or maybe realized in some quiet and calculating way, that Clara would look even more radiant standing next to a girl who had nothing. Evelyn understood it completely. She didn't even feel insulted, not yet. She just felt tired. She needed contrast, Evelyn said. "Don't go," her father said. "I'll find another way." She looked at him. Really looked at him, at the lines around his eyes that had gotten deeper this past year, at the way he held his hands the same way she held hers, when she was trying not to show she was afraid. "There isn't another way," she said. "Not in 60 days. You can't go there to be used. I can go there and decide for myself what I'm going to be." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away. She went back to her mending. The Whitmore carriage arrived 4 days later, early in the morning, before the worst of the summer heat. It was a proper coach lacquered black with a driver up top who tipped his hat but didn't speak. Two other women were already inside the Hargrove cousins, Louise and Faye, who were clearly sisters despite being called cousins by everyone in the county, and who looked at Evelyn's dress with the particular expression of people who have been taught that social rank lives in fabric. "Miss Carter?" said Louise. "Miss Hargrove," said Evelyn, and sat down. Nobody spoke for the first hour. Evelyn looked out the window and watched the Kentucky farmland roll by, the summer green of it, the cornfields beginning to show height, the creek beds running low because July had been dry. She knew this land. She'd grown up with it. She knew exactly where the soil went thin, where it held water wrong, where a field that looked productive would start giving diminishing returns in 3 or 4 more seasons. She wondered if Nathaniel Whitmore knew his land the way she knew her father's. She'd heard the stories same as everyone. Nathaniel Whitmore was 34 years old. He had inherited Whitmore Estate at 22 when his father died, and had tripled its value in the 12 years since. He did not attend social gatherings. He did not go to church with any regularity that anyone could observe. He had been engaged once, years ago, to a woman named Adelaide Prescott, who had broken the engagement when a bad crop year cut the Whitmore income by 1/3, then married a man from Philadelphia 6 months later. People said that after Adelaide, Nathaniel Whitmore had closed something off inside himself, that he had become harder, more precise, that he had decided that sentiment was a liability and had restructured his life accordingly. Faye Hargrove leaned forward and said in a confidential tone that was clearly meant to include everyone in the coach, "I hear he's looking to marry for practical reasons, needs heirs and a capable household manager." "How romantic," Evelyn said without expression. Louise smiled tightly. "Practical isn't the worst thing a man can be." Evelyn turned back to the window. She was not going to Whitmore Estate to marry anyone. She knew that. She knew what she was, a placeholder, a prop in someone else's arrangement. She was going because 60 days was not enough time, and because sometimes the only path forward was the one that felt most humiliating, and you walked it with your spine straight anyway. Whitmore Estate was larger than she'd expected. Not the house she'd expected the house to be large, had prepared herself for the impression of it. It was the land that caught her. The scope of it. The long fields running south, the tree line that marked the eastern edge of the property, the kitchen gardens planted in rows so precise they looked surveyed. Whoever was managing this land was managing it well. She noticed the south field, something about the color of the crop in that section, a slight yellowing at the tips of the leaves that the others hadn't caught yet. She filed it away. Inside the house, Mrs. Harriet Beaumont was waiting. Harriet Beaumont was a woman in her late 40s who had the particular energy of someone who had made a decision and spent the last several weeks convincing herself it was virtuous. She greeted each arrival with practiced warmth, the kind that came from experience rather than feeling. When she got to Evelyn, her eyes moved over the blue dress once quickly and then looked away. "Miss Carter," she said, "so glad you could join us. You'll be in the East Room." The East Room, Evelyn would discover, was the smallest guest room in the house. It caught the morning sun, which was pleasant and had a view of the servants' courtyard rather than the garden. She set her one bag on the narrow bed and stood there for a moment. "They didn't make it subtle," she said to no one. Then she washed her face, straightened her dress, and went down to meet the rest of them. There were 11 women in total. Evelyn counted at dinner that first evening. Most were from prosperous families, not wealthy exactly, but comfortable. They wore better fabric than she did. They spoke with the easy assurance of people who had never had to calculate whether they could afford thread. Clara Beaumont presided over the table with a grace that was genuine. Evelyn could see that. Whatever else Clara was, she was not unintelligent and she was not lazy. She knew how to move a conversation. She knew how to make a room feel like it was orbiting her without appearing to try. Nathaniel Whitmore did not eat with them that first evening. "He'll be joining us tomorrow," Harriet said with a brightness that had a current of anxiety underneath it. No one at the table mentioned that the man whose house they were sitting in hadn't bothered to meet them on arrival. No one except Margaret Whitmore, who was Nathaniel's grandmother, and appeared at the foot of the table like someone who had earned the right to say exactly what she thought. Margaret Whitmore was 68 years old and had spent 40 years watching people pretend to be better than they were. She had the look of someone who found most social performance mildly tedious. She sat down, poured herself water instead of wine, and looked at each woman at the table in turn. When her eyes landed on Evelyn, they stayed there a moment longer than the others. Evelyn met her gaze steadily. Something shifted in the old woman's expression. Not warmth exactly. Attention. "You're Carter's daughter," Margaret said. "Thomas Carter from Harlan County." "Yes, ma'am. I knew your grandfather." She said it and moved on, and the table moved with her, but Evelyn was aware that something had just happened that she didn't entirely understand. The end. Nathaniel Whitmore came to breakfast the next morning at 7 o'clock. He was not what she had expected, and she wasn't sure later what exactly she had expected. Taller maybe, colder in appearance, the kind of man who looked like his reputation. He was tall, but not unusually so. He had the kind of face that had probably been harder to read when he was younger and was harder still now. He moved through the breakfast room with the ease of someone who didn't have to think about whether he belonged somewhere, which was its own kind of authority. He greeted each woman's in turn. Correct, measured, brief. He said the right things in the right order, and Evelyn could see watching from her end of the table that he was performing cordiality, the way some people performed prayers going through the form of it, without any particular investment in the content. When he got to her, he stopped for a moment. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." He looked at her, not in the way men sometimes looked at women assessing appearance, but in a more precise way, like he was trying to read something she might not have intended to show. "My grandmother mentioned you," he said. "She mentioned my grandfather," Evelyn said. "I wasn't there for the relevant part." Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement, closer to surprise. "No," he said. "I suppose you weren't." He moved on to the next woman. The weeks were structured with a veneer of leisure that disguised their actual purpose. There were walks organized across the estate, meals taken together, evenings in the parlor. Nathaniel Whitmore joined some of them and absented himself from others, and there was no visible system to when he appeared, which meant that every social event carried an undercurrent of performance anxiety among most of the women present. Had to be dressed, had to be positioned, had to be on. Evelyn stopped trying to anticipate him by the third day. She spent her time differently than the others. She talked to the kitchen women. She spent an afternoon with Margaret Whitmore, who had opinions about corn yields and land drainage, and the long-term viability of certain farming practices in the bluegrass region that Evelyn found genuinely interesting. She helped a young housemaid named Peg find a lost key that turned out to have fallen behind the sideboard in the second hallway. She read in the East Room in the evenings, when the social performance in the parlor became more than she could sustain. She did not go out of her way to be seen by Nathaniel Whitmore. This was not strategy. It was simply that she didn't have the energy to perform herself, and she had decided on the first night in the East Room that if she was going to be used as a backdrop, she was at least going to use the time to be herself. On the sixth day, they walked the South Field. It was a group excursion organized by Harriet Beaumont, who wore impractical shoes for it and spent most of the walk looking pained. The women walked and remarked on the beauty of the property and said nice things about the harvest prospects with the confidence of people who had no idea what they were looking at. Nathaniel walked slightly apart from the group. Evelyn had noticed that about him he was present, but positioned at the edge of every gathering as if he needed to be able to see everything at once. They reached the South Field, and Evelyn stopped. The yellowing she'd noticed on arrival had spread. Not dramatically, a careful observer would still miss it, but she knew what it meant. The soil in this section was holding too much moisture, not from rain, from something underground. A slow drainage problem that would cost him a meaningful portion of this harvest if it wasn't addressed in the next 2 weeks. "The land is perfect," Harriet said, sweeping her arm in a gesture that was clearly meant for Nathaniel's benefit. "No, sir," Evelyn said. Everyone went quiet. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. She'd meant to think it. But the words were already out, and she was already looking at Nathaniel Whitmore, and there was nothing to do now except say the rest of it. "The land is beautiful," she said, "but that field is in trouble. Those leaves are telling you something. The soil in this section isn't draining right. There's water sitting beneath the surface where there shouldn't be. If you don't address the drainage in the next 2 weeks, you're going to lose a substantial portion of this harvest." Silence. The kind of silence that falls when someone breaks an unspoken rule about what a woman is supposed to say in a mixed gathering in the summer of 1817. Nathaniel Whitmore was looking at her. "That's a significant claim," he said. His voice was even, unreadable. "Yes, sir, it is." "You're sure?" "I grew up farming. I know what unhealthy crop looks like. I could be wrong about the cause, but I'm not wrong about the leaves." Another beat of silence. Clara Beaumont said with careful lightness, "Evelyn, I'm sure Mr. Whitmore knows his own land." "I'd like to hear more," Nathaniel said. He said it to Evelyn, not to Clara, not to the group. Evelyn hesitated for only a moment, then walked into the field a few paces, crouched down, and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. It came back wet. She held her hand up so he could see. He came and stood beside her and looked at her fingers, and then at the ground, and then across the field with an expression she couldn't read. "I noticed it when we arrived," she said more quietly. "The color was wrong even then. It's gotten worse." "How would you fix it?" he said. She looked at him sideways. "You want my suggestion?" "I asked for it. Drainage channels running along the western edge of this section. Open them enough to redirect the subsurface water, and you'll protect the bulk of the yield. It'll take labor and time, but you have 2 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. They walked back to the house. No one said anything for a while. Then Louise Hargrove murmured something to her sister, and the murmur spread, and Evelyn heard the shape of it without needing to hear the words. "Who does she think she is?" She kept walking. 3 days later, she saw Whitmore's foreman directing a work crew along the western edge of the south field. She didn't mention it to anyone. The kindnesses she did were small, and she didn't think about them much. She helped Peg find the key. She spent time with old Amos, the head groundskeeper, who was near 70 and had a bad knee, and who talked about horticulture with a precision and passion that she found more interesting than anything being discussed in the parlor. She noticed that the cook, a woman named Delia, was exhausted and overwrought on the days when Harriet Beaumont decided to change the dinner plan at the last moment. And on those days, Evelyn made herself useful in small ways that Delia didn't ask for and didn't have to acknowledge. None of these people had anything to give her. No social position, no influence, nothing that would help her situation. She knew that. She helped them anyway because there was no particular reason not to, and because being useful made the long evenings feel less empty. Margaret Whitmore noticed. She found Evelyn in the garden one afternoon after Amos had finished telling her the entire history of the rose plantings, and she sat down beside her on the low stone wall and said nothing for a moment. "You're not trying to win," Margaret said finally. Evelyn considered this. "No, ma'am." "Why not?" She thought about the honest answer. She decided to give it. "Because I don't think I was brought here to win," she said. Mrs. Beaumont needed someone to stand next to Clara and make her look better. I knew that when I accepted the invitation. I came anyway because we need the money, and I didn't have a better option. But I can't make myself perform like I have a chance because I don't think I do, and I've never been a good liar. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "You just told me something very few people in this house would have admitted," she said. "You're the first person who's asked me a real question," Evelyn said. The old woman smiled. It was brief and it was real. On the 12th day, everything changed. It started with the child. Nathaniel's cousin, a family of 3, who were staying in the West Wing, visiting from across the state, had a boy named James, who was 7 years old, and who had a gift for appearing in places where no one expected him, and disappearing from places where everyone could see him. The afternoon had been ordinary until it wasn't. The household gathered for an outdoor tea, and James's mother reached the point where she was asking everyone if they'd seen him, and then the asking became something sharper, and then it became fear. Harriet Beaumont turned to look at Evelyn. "He was seen near the stable earlier," she said with a deliberate placement that wasn't a question. "Someone saw a woman walking him that direction." It was a lie so cleanly deployed that for a moment Evelyn just felt the shape of it. Several faces turned toward her. "I haven't been near the stables today," Evelyn said. "Are you certain?" Harriet said with a gentleness that was the cruelest part of it. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I'm certain. I was with Amos in the East Garden until an hour ago. He can confirm it." "Well," Harriet said, "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm only saying what was reported." Nathaniel Whitmore, who had been silent, said, "Where was he seen this morning before the stables?" "The creek path," said his cousin's husband. "Then check the creek," Nathaniel said. "The creek is not safe for a boy his size if he—" "Then we should move quickly," Nathaniel said, cutting through the debate, and he was already moving. He looked at Evelyn as he passed her. Something in that look. She went with him without being asked. They found James 300 yards up the creek path, sitting on a log talking to a turtle, completely unconcerned with the alarm he had caused. He looked up at them with the frank interest of a child who sees nothing wrong with his choices. Evelyn crouched down. "James." "There's a turtle," he said. "I see that. He's a fine turtle. What's his name?" the boy thought. "William. William is a good name." She held out her hand. "Let's go back. Your mama is frightened." He took her hand without protest and stood up. She looked up at Nathaniel Whitmore, who was standing just behind her. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. She straightened up. "We found him," she said. "Yes," he said quietly. They walked back. James chattered the whole way about William and turtles generally, and whether William would be there tomorrow. When they reached the house and his mother came running and pulled him into her arms, James said with great dignity, "I found a turtle." The reunion dissolved the tension in the yard. People began to relax, to laugh, to return to ordinary afternoon. Harriet Beaumont. Evelyn noticed, looked at her with an expression that had no name for it, something between embarrassment and irritation and a quick calculation. Clara Beaumont was standing near her mother. For one moment, Clara and Evelyn looked at each other directly. Clara's expression was more complicated than her mother's. It had something human in it, something almost like shame. Neither of them said anything. That evening, Nathaniel Whitmore came to find her on the east porch. She was sitting in the plain chair there watching the light go down over the fields. She had a cup of water and nothing else. She heard his step on the boards before she saw him. He sat down on the bench against the wall, not close but not far. For a while, neither of them spoke. "The drainage work is done," he said. "I noticed," she said. "You were right about the leaves." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Evelyn." She looked at him. "I want to be honest with you about something," he said. She waited. "This—" He paused as if choosing words with more care than was natural to him. "This arrangement was not my idea. I was persuaded to allow it by people who convinced me it was efficient, that if I needed to find a wife, this was a reasonable process." "I see," she said. "I've been conducting it like an assessment," he said. "I've kept notes, observations about each person." She kept her face still. "I'm telling you this because—" He stopped. "Because you're the only person in this house who hasn't tried to present a performance to me, and I think you should know that I have been performing the same thing I was judging others for." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "You didn't see people," she said. "You measured them." He didn't flinch from it. "Yes." including me, including you. He met her eyes. And I'm telling you now because you have a right to know. And because, whatever my observations were, they're not what I'm seeing. She looked back at the fields. The light was nearly gone. The air had cooled a little the way it did at the end of a summer day in Kentucky, not cold, but easier. "What will you do with the notes?" she asked. He said nothing for a moment. "I haven't decided," he said. She nodded. She stood up. She set down the cup. "Good night, Mr. Whitmore," she said. She went inside. She lay in the narrow East Room bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about what had just happened. He had told her the truth. She didn't know what to do with that, because truthfulness was not what she had expected from this house, from this arrangement, from any part of what she'd walked into. She thought about her father's face across the kitchen table. 60 days. She thought about Clara Beaumont's expression in the yard. She thought about Margaret Whitmore saying, "You're not trying to win with that brief, real smile." She thought about a turtle named William. Then she closed her eyes and made herself stop thinking. Tomorrow would come whether she was ready for it or not. She pressed her hand flat against her chest the way she had pressed it against the scorched invitation and made the same promise she'd made that morning at the kitchen table. "I may lose everything else, but I have not lost myself." She held on to that. The summer dark settled over Whitmore Estate, and somewhere in the main house the candles were still burning. The morning after Nathaniel Whitmore told her the truth, Evelyn came down to breakfast and found his chair empty. No one mentioned it. Harriet Beaumont poured coffee and made cheerful observations about the weather, and the Hargrove cousins talked about the walk planned for the afternoon, and Clara sat at the center of the table, being effortlessly lovely in a way that required considerable effort. The absence at the head of the table was treated like something that hadn't happened. Evelyn ate her eggs and said nothing. It was Margaret Whitmore, materializing at the foot of the table the way she always did. Sudden, unbothered, slightly ahead of whatever the room was prepared for. Who said without preamble? Nathaniel rode out at first light. He wanted to see the drainage work himself. "At first light," Harriet said. "He's always been like that," Margaret said. "When something matters to him, he can't leave it to other people." She looked at Evelyn. He checked it himself. Evelyn looked down at her plate. Louise Hargrove said brightly, "How dedicated." Said Margaret in a tone that communicated exactly how much she cared about Louise Hargrove's assessment. Evelyn finished her breakfast and excused herself. She was halfway down the hall when she heard Clara Beaumont's voice behind her, low, deliberate, clearly intended to carry just far enough. "She's not what I expected," Clara said. To her mother, Evelyn assumed. To the controlled space just behind her. She kept walking. She didn't want to know what Clara had expected. She went to the east garden where Amos was already working, despite the morning heat moving slowly because of his knee, but moving with the particular patience of someone who had made peace with his own pace. She sat on the stone wall and watched him work, and after a while, she picked up the spare trowel and started on the section nearest her without being asked. They worked side by side in comfortable silence for a long time. Then Amos said without looking up, "The foreman told me you spotted the drainage problem before anyone else." "The leaves were yellowing," she said. "Plenty of people walked that field," he said. "Nobody else saw it." She turned soil and didn't say anything. "Mr. Whitmore came out to the garden yesterday evening," Amos said. "Before he found you on the porch. He asked me about you." She stopped. "What did he ask?" Amos looked up. He had a slow, careful face, the kind that came from years of watching things grow at their own pace and learning not to rush what wasn't ready. "He asked how you treated people who couldn't do anything for you." Evelyn didn't move for a moment. "What did you tell him?" she said. "I told him the truth," Amos said, and went back to his work. She sat with that. The garden was quiet except for the tools and the birds and the distant sound of the estate beginning its working day. She turned the trowel over in her hands and thought about what it meant that Nathaniel Whitmore had come out to ask an old groundskeeper about the woman with the mended blue dress. She thought it probably meant more than she knew what to do with. She put the trowel down and said, "Amos, have you worked here long?" 31 years, he said. "Did you know his father?" "I did." "And the woman, Adelaide Prescott?" Amos was quiet for a moment. He pressed a small plant into the soil and packed it carefully. "I knew of her," he said. "She was here twice, maybe 3 times." "What was he like then before?" Amos thought. "Easier," he said finally. "Not easy, but easier. He laughed more. Not much more, but some." He paused. "She left him when it got hard. People think it was the money. But I don't think it was just the money." "What do you think it was?" "I think she left him because she'd always planned to leave him if it got hard," Amos said. "And he didn't know that until she went. And knowing it, finding out that a person was never really with you, just near you, that changes something. That's not something you just get over." Evelyn was quiet. "No," she said. "It isn't." She helped him finish the section. When she stood up to go back inside, Amos didn't look up, but he said, "Miss Carter." "Yes." "He's watching people to figure out who's real," the old man said, "because he can't trust his own judgment anymore. Don't hold it against him entirely." She walked back to the house thinking about that, about what it meant to lose trust in your own ability to read people, about how you rebuilt it if you could, about whether you could do it alone, or whether it took someone being real enough long enough that eventually you had no choice but to believe them. She didn't have an answer. She went upstairs to change out of her gardening clothes, and that was when she found the note under her door. It was unsigned. One line in a hand she didn't recognize. "Be careful about making yourself indispensable to people who haven't decided what they want yet." She stood there holding it for a long moment. Then she turned it over, looking for something more. There was nothing. She folded it and put it in the pocket of her apron and went to change. She knew who had written it. She couldn't prove it, but she knew. Clara Beaumont had lovely handwriting. Evelyn pressed her hand flat against the pocket and felt the folded paper and thought, so this is what afraid looks like on a woman who has everything. It wasn't nothing understanding that. Clara Beaumont was afraid of her, not threatened the way rivals were threatened. Afraid. That was a different thing entirely. She filed it away. She put on the clean dress, her other dress, the gray one, with the collar she'd repaired twice, and went down to rejoin the day. Nathaniel Whitmore was back by noon. He came in from the south field with his hat in his hand and mud on his boots that the household staff would have something to say about later. And he went straight to the dining room where lunch was being laid, and he sat down and didn't mention where he'd been. But when he looked down the table and his eyes landed on Evelyn, he nodded. Just that. A single nod. She looked back at him evenly and didn't smile because she was not going to perform gratitude for a man confirming that she'd been right about his crops. But she felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Just slightly. Harriet Beaumont said with careful timing, "Mr. Whitmore, Clara has been absolutely devoted to the planning of this evening's entertainment. She has such gifts for creating an atmosphere." Nathaniel looked at Clara. "Is that so?" "I hope it pleases you," Clara said with genuine grace. Whatever else she was, Clara was good at this. She meant the words, even if she also calculated them. "I thought some music after dinner and perhaps a reading. Something that feels like home rather than performance." "That sounds fine," Nathaniel said. He was looking at his plate now, not at Clara, and Harriet Beaumont's expression shifted for just a moment, a flicker of assessment of recalculation before resetting to pleasantness. Evelyn watched all of this and ate her bread. Fay Hargrove on her right leaned close and murmured, "You should play tonight, if you play." "I play a little," Evelyn said. "Then play," Fay said with an unexpected firmness. "Don't let Clara be the only voice in that room." Evelyn looked at her surprised. Fay shrugged, which was the most honest thing she'd done in 12 days. "I'm not going to win this," Fay said quietly. "Neither is Louise. We all know it. But I'd like to leave here, having watched something real happen for once." Evelyn thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. The evening came on warm and heavy, the way Kentucky summer evenings did, full of the smell of honeysuckle, and dried grass, and the distant suggestion of a storm that might come tomorrow or might not come at all. The parlor was lit with more candles than usual. Harriet Beaumont had arranged everything beautifully. She had genuine talent for it, and Clara was at the center of the room in a pale yellow dress that was exactly right for the light. Clara played piano first, and she played well. Not brilliantly, but with feeling, with the kind of competence that spoke to years of discipline. She chose a piece that was soft and deliberate, and she played it with her back straight and her expression composed, and when she finished, the room applauded with warmth that was sincere. Nathaniel, sitting in the chair nearest the fireplace, applauded with everyone else. His face was polite. Then Harriet turned to the room and said, "Does anyone else play?" The silence that followed had a particular texture, the texture of people deciding whether to volunteer or to protect themselves. Evelyn stood up. She felt Fay Hargrove's small exhale of satisfaction beside her. She sat down at the piano and adjusted the bench. She hadn't played in 2 years. There was no instrument at home anymore. They'd sold it, one of the many things that had gone quietly when the debts started. Her hands remembered what her mind wasn't always sure of. She played an old Virginia folk tune. Nothing refined, nothing designed to impress. It was a song she'd grown up with, a song her mother had sung, a song that knew exactly what it was and didn't apologize for any of it. The room was quiet in a different way than it had been for Clara. When she finished, the applause was more uncertain, slower, smaller, but something in it was different. Like people weren't entirely sure what they'd just heard, but felt it somewhere anyway. She stood up and went back to her seat. Nathaniel Whitmore was looking at her, not with the assessing look, not with the precise measuring up quality that she'd gotten used to seeing on his face. Something else. Something she didn't have a name for and wasn't going to spend energy inventing one. Clara, who had watched all of this, said in a voice that was careful and measured and almost warm, "That was lovely, Evelyn. I didn't know you played." "A little," Evelyn said. "Your mother teach you?" "Yes," Evelyn said. A pause. "Mine too," Clara said. It was not an olive branch exactly, but it was something. The first human thing Clara Beaumont had said directly to her in 2 weeks. Evelyn looked at her. "She taught you well." Clara nodded once briefly and looked away. That was all. But Evelyn thought about it for a long time after. The evening wound down. People drifted to bed. Harriet held court for a while in the far corner, clearly working through some recalculation that Evelyn could feel from across the room, but couldn't read precisely. Evelyn was almost to the stairs when Margaret Whitmore appeared at her elbow. "Walk with me a moment," the old woman said. They walked to the end of the hall where a window looked out onto the dark east garden. "Nathaniel asked me tonight what I thought of you," Margaret said. Evelyn kept her expression still. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you reminded me of his mother," Margaret said. "She was a Carter, did you know that? Not your line different branch, but the same family generations back." Evelyn had not known that. "I told him," Margaret went on, "that his mother was the only person who ever made his father a better man, not by trying to, not by working at it, just by being someone who couldn't be fooled and wouldn't pretend to be." The hall was quiet. "I don't know what Nathaniel is going to do," Margaret said. "He doesn't trust his own heart. He makes himself think instead of feel, because feeling got him gutted once, and he hasn't recovered from it. But I want you to know that whatever happens in this house, I see you." She paused. "And what I see is not nothing." Evelyn looked at her. The old woman's face in the dim hall light was composed and certain and tired in the way of someone who had watched a great deal of human foolishness and was still at 68 hoping something would go right. "Thank you, ma'am," Evelyn said. She meant it. She went upstairs and lay in the narrow east room bed and listened to the summer night sounds of the estate and thought about a woman named Adelaide Prescott who had been near someone without ever being with him, and about what that kind of discovery did to a person's ability to trust their own knowing. She thought about Nathaniel Whitmore at first light on a horse checking drainage work, because when something mattered to him, he couldn't leave it to other people. She thought about a one-line note in Clara Beaumont's handwriting. She thought about Amos saying he's watching people to figure out who's real. She turned over. She made herself stop. Tomorrow would come. It came faster than she expected. She woke before dawn. A sound something outside her window, a voice at a distance. She lay still and listened. It resolved into two voices, and then into the specific quality of an argument being conducted by people who were trying not to be overheard. Harriet Beaumont's voice, and a man's voice she didn't recognize. She got up quietly and went to the window. She couldn't see them, they were around the corner below and to the left near the back entrance. But she could hear fragments. Enough. Cannot let this continue. Said it would be handled. The Carter girl is. Then a long, low answer she couldn't make out, and then Harriet again sharper. Not why she was invited. Silence. Then footsteps. Then nothing. Evelyn stood at the window for a long time. Then she went back to bed and lay there with her eyes open until the dawn came properly, and she thought about exactly what she had just heard, and exactly what it meant, and exactly what it said about the position she was standing in. She was not surprised. She had known from the beginning what she was here to be. The surprise was that it had taken this long for the machinery to become audible. When she came down to breakfast, her face was composed. She ate. She made appropriate conversation. She watched. Harriet Beaumont across the table was warm and gracious, and gave nothing away. She was a woman who had practiced this for a very long time. Evelyn could do the same. She was her father's daughter. Thomas Carter hadn't raised someone who fell apart when the ground shifted. She was halfway through her second cup of coffee when Nathaniel Whitmore came in, and this morning he didn't go to his chair first. He came directly to where she was sitting, in front of everyone, in the full light of the breakfast room with every woman at that table, and Harriet Beaumont at the head of it, and Clara in her usual place. He stood at her shoulder. "Miss Carter," he said, "I'd like to show you the west pasture after breakfast if you're willing. I want your opinion on something." The table went very still. Not the uncertain quiet that had followed her playing last night. Something sharper. Something that had teeth. Evelyn set down her coffee cup. "Of course," she said. She felt Harriet Beaumont's stillness across the table. She felt it like a change in temperature. She did not look at Clara. After breakfast, they walked to the west pasture. It was just the two of them. No organized group. No Harriet Beaumont with her impractical shoes. No cluster of women performing interest in the property. Just Nathaniel Whitmore and Evelyn Carter walking across the morning grass with the sun already building heat. He didn't ask her about the pasture for the first several minutes. They walked. The estate spread around them, and she could feel how much land it was. Really feel it. Not just see it, but understand it. The weight and cost and responsibility of it. The thing that had to be managed and protected and thought about every day. "You heard something this morning," he said. She looked at him. "I heard voices below my window," she said. "Before dawn." "Do you know what was said?" "Enough of it." He was quiet for a moment. "I owe you an explanation." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "Don't do that," he said. She stopped walking. He stopped too. "Don't tell me. I don't owe you anything, when we both know this conversation matters," he said. "I've had enough of people being polite instead of honest." She looked at him. His face was set, jaw tight, eyes direct, and tired in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the measuring look, not the performance of authority. Just a man who was worn out from managing a situation that had gotten away from him. "Then be honest," she said. He turned and looked out at the pasture. "Harriet Beaumont arranged this whole process," he said. "I told her I was willing to consider marriage, and she turned it into this. I should have been clearer about what I wanted. I wasn't because I wasn't sure what I wanted." He paused. "You were invited because Harriet thought your situation made you useful, a contrast. Someone who made the other candidates look more advantageous by comparison. I know, Evelyn said. He looked at her. You've always known. From the moment I read the letter. And you came anyway. We needed the money, she said. It was the plainest and most honest thing she could have said, and she said it without apology. Something moved in his face. Not pity, she would have walked away from pity. Something else. Something that looked more like respect. What Harriet said this morning, he said, was that your presence here had become inconvenient. Inconvenient, Evelyn repeated. She believes you've made a certain impression that was not intended. He stopped. She'd like you to leave. The summer air hung around them. Evelyn felt it land the words, the meaning, the full shape of what was happening. She had come here to be a shadow. She had refused to be one. And now the woman who had built the entire arrangement was telling the man at the center of it that the shadow had become a problem. And what do you want? Evelyn said. The question sat between them. Nathaniel Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. She watched him decide something. She couldn't tell what. His face in full daylight was harder to read than she'd expected because there were things moving behind it that he was clearly not in the habit of letting anyone see. I want to stop running a performance and start having a real conversation, he said. She was quiet. But I also don't know how to do that, he said, without making promises I'm not ready to make or asking things of you that aren't mine to ask. He stopped again. My grandmother told me I was a coward once. I told her she was wrong. I've been wondering lately if she was right. She probably was, Evelyn said. His expression shifted, startled, then something that was almost amusement, then something more complicated. Evelyn? He said. Just her name. First name. Something in the way he said it was unguarded for the first time. She waited. I burned the notes, he said. Last night. All of them. Every observation I'd written down about every person in that house. He met her eyes. I don't want to measure people anymore. I'm tired of it. She felt something shift in her chest again. The same thing that had loosened slightly at the nod across the table, but larger this time. She was not going to let herself run toward it. She was not built that way. And even if she had been, she was too clear-headed about her own situation to be reckless. But she didn't turn away from it either. What happened between you and Adelaide Prescott, she said, was not about the money. He went very still. I know that's not my business, she said. You don't have to answer. No, he said slowly. You're right. He didn't say which part she was right about, the part where it wasn't about money, or the part where it wasn't her business. She thought maybe he meant both. They stood in the west pasture with the summer sun climbing and the grass drying and the estate working itself around them, and Evelyn thought, this is a man who has been alone for a very long time and has told himself it was a choice. She thought, I know what that looks like because I've done it too. She said, what did you want to show me out here? He blinked. Then he almost smiled. The soil, he said. In the northeast corner. Tell me what you think. They walked to it together. She crouched down and looked. He crouched beside her close enough that she could hear him breathing, and she ran her fingers through the soil the same way she'd done in the south field reading it. This section's fine, she said. Better than fine, actually. The drainage here is natural. You've got good slope to the east. This is some of the best farmland on your property. That's what I thought, he said. She looked at him. Then why did you bring me out here? To see if you'd tell me the truth, he said. Even when the truth is that everything is fine. She looked at him for a moment. You keep testing people, she said. Old habit. It's a bad one. Yes, he said. I know. They stood up. She brushed the soil off her fingers. He did the same, and for a moment they were just two people standing in a field with dirt on their hands and nothing to prove. What are you going to tell Harriet Beaumont? Evelyn said. That Miss Carter is staying, he said, because I'd like her to. Her heart did something complicated, and she told it firmly to behave itself. You know that's going to make things difficult, she said. More difficult than they already are. Considerably, she said. Harriet is not going to accept this gracefully. Clara. I don't know what Clara will do, but her mother is a woman who has invested a great deal in a particular outcome, and she is not going to release it without a fight. I know, he said. And my situation doesn't change, she said. Whatever is happening here, whatever this is, my father's debts are still real. The 60 days are still counting. I'm not telling you this because I want something from you. I'm telling you because I want you to understand what you're dealing with when you deal with me. There's no pretty story here. There's just the truth. He looked at her steadily. I know, he said again. And then, I prefer the truth. She nodded once. They walked back to the house. At the edge of the yard she slowed, and he slowed with her. One more thing, she said. Yes. Whatever this is, she said carefully, I need you to be sure of it before it becomes something. Because I don't have a position here that I can afford to lose, and I don't have the kind of cushion that absorbs mistakes. She paused. I'm not asking you to be certain of things no one can be certain of. I'm asking you to mean it when you say it. He was quiet for a long moment. That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years, he said. I know, she said. That's why I said it. She went inside. She walked past Harriet Beaumont in the hall without stopping, and Harriet's eyes tracked her with a sharpness that had dropped all pretense of pleasantness, and Evelyn felt it and kept walking. She went to the east room and sat on the narrow bed and pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. Something had changed this morning. She didn't know exactly what. She didn't know what it would cost her. She didn't know if the man in that west pasture, the man who had burned his notes and still couldn't entirely stop testing, was someone who was capable of the thing she had just told him she needed him to be. But she knew this. She had told him the truth about herself clearly and without softening it, and he had not looked away. That was not nothing. Down the hall a door opened and closed. The house breathed around her. The estate sounds, the summer sounds. The sounds of 11 women in various rooms recalibrating, calculating, deciding what to do with this morning. Somewhere in the house Harriet Beaumont was doing the same. Evelyn stood up. She straightened her collar. She checked the pocket of her apron. The folded note was still there. She thought about a woman who had left when it got hard, and the man she'd left behind, and the 31 years Amos had been watching and waiting and tending and hoping something would go right. She thought, if I lose this, I lose it honest. I will not lose it pretending. She opened the door. And in the hall just rounding the corner was Clara Beaumont. They stopped. They looked at each other. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Clara said very quietly, I wrote the note. I know, Evelyn said. Clara's chin lifted slightly. I'm not sorry I wrote it. I know that too, Evelyn said. Another silence. Are you going to tell him? Clara said. Evelyn thought about it. Really thought about it. Not the strategic answer. Not the answer that served her position, but the true answer. No, she said. Clara looked at her. Something in her expression fractured barely a hairline crack in the composure. Why not? She said. Because you're afraid, Evelyn said, and I'm not going to punish someone for being afraid. That's not who I am. Clara stared at her. Evelyn walked past her toward the stairs. She was almost at the top when Clara said behind her so quietly that she almost didn't hear it. That's why he's looking at you. Evelyn didn't stop, but she heard it. She carried it with her all the way to the top of the stairs and down the hall and through the rest of the morning, and she thought, this is not a victory. This is just a day. There are many more days to go, and not all of them are going to be like this one. But she was still here, and she was still herself. And for now, in this house, in this summer, in this life that had narrowed itself down to 60 days, and one blue dress and a narrow east room bed, that was enough to stand on. That was more than enough. The day after her conversation with Clara in the hallway, Evelyn woke to find that her position in the house had shifted in ways no one said out loud, But everyone understood. It was small things first. The way the Hargrove cousins moved apart slightly when she entered a room not hostile, just uncertain, recalibrating. The way Harriet Beaumont spoke to her at breakfast with a warmth so precise it had no warmth in it at all. The way two of the other women from the outer counties, women whose names she'd learned, but who had never sought her out, suddenly found reasons to be in the same spaces she was watching, with the careful attention of people trying to understand which way a situation was moving before they decided where to stand. Evelyn let them watch. She went about her morning the way she always did. She spoke to Delia in the kitchen, who was in a better mood because last night's dinner had gone without the last-minute changes that usually wrecked her afternoon. She checked in on Amos, whose knee was worse in the morning damp, and who was sitting on the low garden wall pretending he hadn't been planning to rest. She read for an hour in the East Room, with the window open, a book of agricultural theory she'd found on the estate library shelf that Nathaniel Whitmore had clearly read. Himself. There were pencil marks in the margins, small and precise, the annotations of someone who read to argue with the text. She thought about that, about a man who argued with books alone in a library. She thought it was probably the loneliest thing she'd learned about him so far. At mid-morning, Harriet Beaumont called a gathering in the main parlor. She framed it as something light, a casual assembly. She set a chance for everyone to spend some time together before the afternoon. She had a way of framing things that made their real purpose invisible until you were already inside them. Evelyn sat near the window. Harriet stood at the front of the room and smiled at everyone and said in a voice calibrated for warmth, "I thought it might be lovely if we each shared something about ourselves this morning, what we hope for, what we value most, a little more personal than our usual conversation." No one objected. You didn't object to Harriet Beaumont when she used that particular tone. They went around the room. The Hargrove cousins talked about family and stability and the importance of a well-ordered household. Two of the other women talked about devotion and faith. One spoke about her love of music in a way that cast a sideways glance at Evelyn's playing from the previous evening. Clara, when her turn came, spoke briefly and with genuine feeling about home, what it meant to build one, what it meant to deserve one. And Evelyn noticed that Nathaniel, who had appeared in the doorway midway through the gathering without anyone making a fuss about it, was listening to Clara with something that might have been respect. Then Harriet's eyes landed on Evelyn. "Miss Carter," she said, "what do you value most?" The room adjusted its attention. Evelyn looked at Harriet Beaumont. She saw the architecture of the question, the way it was built to expose her, to make her say something that would sound either presumptuous or inadequate, to remind everyone in the room that she was not what the others were. She said, "Honesty." Just that. One word. "How admirable," Harriet said, and moved on, but the word sat in the room. Evelyn felt it sitting there, and she felt something else too. The small shift in weight that happens when a simple answer turns out to be harder to dismiss than an elaborate one. Faye Hargrove, 2 chairs away, looked at her hands and said nothing, but the corner of her mouth moved. Nathaniel Whitmore in the doorway was very still. After the gathering broke up, Harriet touched Evelyn's arm as she passed. The touch was light and precise and utterly deliberate. "A word, Miss Carter," she said. They stood in the side hall alone. Harriet dropped the performance of warmth like setting down a heavy bag. "I'm going to be direct with you," she said. "Please," Evelyn said. "My daughter has worked toward this her entire life," Harriet said. "Her entire life. I have invested everything I have, my time, my money, my connections, to ensure that she is prepared for exactly this kind of opportunity. What you are doing in this house is not fair to her." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "What am I doing, Mrs. Beaumont?" "You know what you're doing." "I've been honest with people," Evelyn said. "I've helped where I could. I haven't tried to take anything that wasn't offered. If that's unfair to Clara, I'd ask you to explain to me how." Harriet's expression tightened. "You were not invited here to compete." "No," Evelyn said. "I was invited here to stand behind your daughter and make her look better. I understand that, but I'm afraid I can't be less than I am in order to make someone else's position more comfortable. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." The words were polite. The meaning was not. Harriet looked at her for a long moment. The calculation behind her eyes was open now, undisguised, and it was not comfortable to look at. "Mr. Whitmore will make a sensible decision," Harriet said finally. "I'm sure he will," Evelyn said. She walked away. Her hands were perfectly steady at her sides, and her heart was hammering, and she did not let either of those facts show on her face. She found Margaret Whitmore in the East Corridor. "You heard that?" Evelyn said. "Parts of it," Margaret said without guilt. "These old walls." "What does she mean by sensible?" "She means," Margaret said, "that she has had several conversations with Nathaniel over the past week, and that she believes she has positioned Clara's suitability in a way that makes the practical argument overwhelming." She paused. "Harriet is very good at practical arguments." Evelyn absorbed this. "And is she right?" Evelyn asked. "Is the practical argument overwhelming?" Margaret looked at her with the direct patience of someone who has watched enough to know that some things can't be rushed, and some things can't be avoided. "My grandson is a man who built this estate on precision and logic, because someone taught him that was the only safe way to live. Harriet knows that. She built her argument on that foundation." She paused. "But precision and logic are not the only things Nathaniel is." "What else is he?" "Lonely," Margaret said. Simple and final, the way she said most things. That stayed with Evelyn. She carried it through the afternoon and into the evening, and she was still carrying it when the storm that had been suggesting itself for 2 days finally arrived after dinner. Not the gentle summer rain she'd been expecting, but a real storm, fast and loud, the kind that knocked branches and sent everyone inside and changed the air pressure in a way that made the whole house feel different. She was in the library when it hit. She'd gone there after dinner because she wanted to be somewhere quiet, and because the book with Nathaniel's pencil notes was still on the table where she'd left it that morning. She sat with it and read in the lamplight, and listened to the storm working itself out, and she was so absorbed that she didn't hear the door open until he was already in the room. Nathaniel Whitmore stopped when he saw her. "I didn't know anyone was in here," he said. "I'll go," she said, starting to stand. "No." He said it quickly, then more carefully. "No, please. I come here when I want to think, and you seem to have had the same idea. And I don't see why we can't both use a library." She settled back. He sat in the chair across from her, not close, and looked at the book in her hands. "You found the Bordley," he said. "It's good," she said. "Your notes are better." He looked at her. Something crossed his face. "You read my notes. They were in the margin. I couldn't miss them." "What did you think?" "I think you're right about the soil preparation argument and wrong about the crop rotation schedule," she said. "But I'd want to see your land records before I was sure about the rotation." He was quiet for a moment. "No one has ever argued with my margin notes before." "Well," she said, "you wrote them in a book you left on a table. The storm ran its course around them, and they sat in the library and talked about farming. Just that the actual specific practice of it, the soil and the timing and the labor costs, and the particular challenges of Kentucky land versus Virginia land versus what either of them had read about the northern states. He knew more than she did about the large-scale economics of it. She knew things he'd never thought about, the small-scale precision of it, the daily reading of a field, the kind of knowledge that came from having very little margin for error and having to be right. At some point, the storm quieted. Neither of them had noticed when it happened. She looked up and found him watching her with an expression that wasn't the measuring look, and wasn't the performance of cordiality, and wasn't anything she could easily name. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. And then, before she could let that stand, "I was thinking that this is the first conversation I've had in years that I didn't want to end." The lamp between them was very steady. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them pretended that wasn't what he'd said. "Nathaniel," she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name. She hadn't planned it. It just came out, and they both heard it. "Evelyn," he said quietly. She stood up. Not because she wanted to leave, she didn't, but because she knew with the clear-headed certainty that had kept her intact through everything that this moment needed to be handled with care, or it would break something that wasn't ready to be broken. "I'm going to go upstairs," she said. "Not because I want to, because I think we should both sleep on whatever this is before we say anything else about it." He stood up when she did. It was automatic old manners, deep manners. "You're right," he said. "I usually am," she said. "It's one of my more irritating qualities." He did smile then, a real one, brief and unguarded, and she felt it like a physical thing, and was very glad she was already moving toward the door. She was nearly through it when he said, "Evelyn." She stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for the conversation, for all of it." She didn't turn around. "Good night, Nathaniel," she said and went upstairs. She lay in the east room with the storm-cooled air coming through the window and her heart doing complicated things in her chest, and she thought, "This is dangerous and real, and I don't know what it costs yet, and I am going to have to be very careful." She thought about Harriet Beaumont and her practical arguments. She thought about Clara's face in the hallway. "That's why he's looking at you." She thought about 60 days. She was still thinking when she heard it. Voices. Again. Below her window like before, but different, more urgent, less careful. She went to the window in the dark and listened. Harriet. And this time, a second woman. Clara. Clara's voice was low and controlled, but there was something in it Evelyn had never heard before. Something cracked underneath the control. "Mama, stop," Clara said. "Stop. I'm not doing anything that isn't necessary. You're going to ruin everything." Clara's voice rose slightly, then pulled back. "Not the way you think. You're going to ruin everything by not stopping. Your future is... My future is not built on destroying someone else," Clara said, and the way she said it was not soft. It was iron. "I will not be that woman. I will not win this way." Silence. Then Harriet's voice quieter with an edge. "Clara." "I mean it, Mama." A pause. "Whatever you're planning, don't." Footsteps. A door. Silence. Evelyn stood at the dark window for a long time. Then she went back to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. She was still turning it over in the morning when Delia came to find her before breakfast, breathless and tight around the eyes, and said that something had happened. A ledger was missing from the estate office. Not just any ledger, the land records. The primary document recording the property boundaries. The tenant agreements, the ownership history of every acre of Whitmore land. Gone from the locked cabinet in the estate office where Nathaniel kept the key. The house assembled itself in the main hall with the particular energy of people who have been given an emergency to organize themselves around. Nathaniel was there, and his face was the controlled, precise version of fury, not hot, cold, the kind that was worse. His estate manager, a narrow man named Preston, was going through everything he could think of with the systematic efficiency of someone trying not to show he was frightened. Everyone was there, all 11 women. Harriet Beaumont, Margaret. Nathaniel looked at each face in the room. "The office was locked," he said. "Only Preston and I have keys. The cabinet was also locked, the same." He paused. "I need to know if anyone was in that part of the house last night." Silence. Evelyn was watching faces. She wasn't the only one. She saw Harriet Beaumont's expression, and she saw it very carefully. It was composed. It was the right kind of composed, concerned, sympathetic, appropriate. Not the composed of guilt. The composed of a woman who had thought about how to look before she walked into this room. Evelyn felt the cold understanding settle into her chest. She looked at Clara. Clara's face was different. Clara was pale under her composure, and her hands held together at her waist had the quality of hands that were holding themselves still rather than being still. Nathaniel said, "I want everyone to return to their rooms. Preston and I will speak with each of you individually." People began to move. Harriet said smoothly, "Of course, whatever you need, Nathaniel. I'm sure there's a simple explanation." "I'm sure there is," Nathaniel said, and his eyes moved briefly to Evelyn as he said it, not accusatory. Something else. Something that might have been asking her to wait. She went upstairs. She sat in the east room and thought. The ledger contained the land records, the boundary documentation, in the wrong hands, in the hands of someone with the right legal connections and the motivation to challenge them. Those records could be used to dispute property lines, to raise questions about ownership, to delay or complicate any formal agreement Nathaniel might make, including a marriage agreement that came with property consolidation. She thought about who had the connections and the motivation. She thought about the man whose voice she'd heard below her window that first night. Not Harriet. A man. Someone Harriet was working with. She thought about what Clara had said in the dark. Whatever you're planning, don't. She thought about the key. Nathaniel's key and Preston's key. Both accounted for. Cabinet locked, office locked. But Harriet Beaumont had been in this house for 3 weeks, and Harriet Beaumont was a woman who prepared. Evelyn stood up. She went to Preston's office, not the main estate office, the smaller administrative room where he kept duplicates of routine documents, and she knocked. Preston opened the door and looked at her with the wariness of a man in the middle of a crisis being approached by a variable he hadn't accounted for. "Miss Carter," he said. "When was the last time the duplicate key inventory was checked?" she said. He stared at her. "I beg your pardon. The estate office cabinet has a primary key and a duplicate. The duplicate is kept somewhere in this house as a backup in the event of the primary being lost. It would have been your predecessor who set up that system, if not you. Where is the duplicate kept?" The blood left Preston's face so fast she could see it happen. "The third drawer," he said. "Administrative records room, on the hook behind the correspondence files." "Have you checked it this morning?" she said. He turned without answering, and she followed him to the administrative records room. And he opened the third drawer and moved the correspondence files, and they both looked at the hook. The hook was empty. Preston sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "Someone knew where to look," he said. "Someone who had been in this house before," Evelyn said. "Or someone who had been given the information by someone who had." He looked at her. "That's a serious allegation." "I haven't named anyone," she said. "I've identified the method. That's different." She left him sitting there and went to find Nathaniel. He was in the main estate office alone, standing at the open cabinet with his arms at his sides and his jaw set. She closed the door behind her. He turned. "The duplicate key," she said. "It's gone. Preston is in the administrative records room right now confirming it. Someone who knew the layout of this house, or was told the layout used the duplicate to access this room and the cabinet." He looked at her. "How did you know about the duplicate?" "Every well-run estate has a backup key system," she said. "I was raised on a working farm. It's standard practice. Preston's face told me whether I was right." He turned back to the cabinet. Then he turned back to her. "What else?" he said. She hesitated. Not because she was uncertain, because what she was about to say was going to change things in ways she couldn't fully predict. "The night I arrived," she said, "I heard voices below my window. Harriet Beaumont and a man. I couldn't identify him. Last night I heard Harriet and Clara. Clara told her mother to stop, told her she wouldn't win that way. This morning the ledger is gone." She paused. "I'm telling you what I observed. What you do with it is your decision." Nathaniel was very still. "Clara told her to stop," he said. "Yes. And she didn't." "I don't know that with certainty," Evelyn said. "I know the ledger is gone. I know the duplicate key is gone. I know Harriet Beaumont has been in this house for 3 weeks with access to its routines and its systems. That's what I know." He sat down at the desk. He pressed both hands flat on the surface the way she pressed her hands flat on things when she needed to feel something solid. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "You understand what happens when I find that ledger. This entire arrangement collapses. Everyone goes home, including you." She looked at him. "I know," she said, "and you're telling me anyway." "It's your land," she said. "It's your life. You deserve to know the truth about what's happening in your own house, even when the truth is inconvenient for me." She paused. "That's what I meant when I said I value honesty." He looked at her for a long, still moment. Something happened in his face. A loosening, a breaking open of the precision and the careful management, something underneath it that was raw and real and had been kept behind glass for a very long time. He said, "Evelyn." "Don't," she said gently. "Not right now. Find the ledger first. Protect your land. Do what needs to be done." She moved toward the door. "I'll be in the East Room if you need to speak with me." She had her hand on the door when he said, "I'm going to need to ask you something difficult." She stopped. "When the ledger is found," he said, "and it will be found, I may need you to repeat what you've just told me in front of people who will not be happy to hear it." She turned to look at him over her shoulder. "I know," she said. "It may not end well for you socially," he said. "People who come forward in situations like this are rarely thanked for it." "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Yes. I've been wearing the same dress for 2 weeks," she said. "My social standing was not the primary concern when I arrived." He looked at her. And something in him, something that had been sealed shut and carefully maintained and held together with logic and precision, and the disciplined absence of hope, cracked open just slightly, just enough that the light could get through. The ledger was found that afternoon. Preston, working backward from the duplicate key and forward from Evelyn's account of the voices, traced the path to a saddlebag in the stable packed ready for travel belonging to a man named Calloway, who had arrived 3 days ago as a business associate of the Beaumont family, and who was found when looked for to be absent from the property without announcement. The saddlebag also contained documents, legal drafts, questions about boundary lines in the southeast corner of the estate where the Whitmore land met an older claim that had been quiet for 15 years. Nathaniel looked at the documents for a long time. Then he sent for Harriet Beaumont. Evelyn wasn't in the room for that conversation. She was in the east garden sitting on the low stone wall when Margaret found her and sat down without preamble and said, "You told him?" "Yes, ma'am." "How much?" "Everything I knew." The old woman was quiet for a moment. "Harriet is being comprehensive in her denials." "I expected that." "She says the saddlebag wasn't hers. She says she knew nothing about Calloway's purpose. She says—" Margaret stopped. "She's very good at it." "I know she is," Evelyn said. "Nathaniel believes you over her," Margaret said. "I want you to know that." Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "But believing and proving are different things," the old woman went on. "Calloway is gone. The documents are legal drafts, not legal actions. Harriet's connection to him is social, not contractual. It may be difficult to do anything about it," Evelyn said. Yes, she thought about that. She thought about what it meant that a woman could arrange all of this. The invitation, the scheme, the planted scheme within the scheme, and walk away from it without consequence, because she was smart enough to keep her hands clean on paper. She thought about what Clara had said in the dark. "Margaret," she said. "Clara knew." The old woman looked at her, looked. She told her mother to stop, last night before any of this came to light. She knew something was being planned, and she objected to it. Evelyn paused. "That's not nothing." Margaret looked at her for a long time. "No," she said, "it isn't." "If Clara is willing to say what she knows," Evelyn said, "it changes the picture." "Clara would be going against her mother in a very public way," Margaret said. "I know." "That's asking a great deal." "I know that too," Evelyn said. "I'm not saying she will. I'm saying she could. And I'm saying she's not the person I thought she was when I arrived here." Margaret stood. Her joints gave a sound of protest that she didn't acknowledge. "You'd be willing to let her after what her mother arranged, after the note. After all of it." Evelyn looked at the garden. At the rows Amos had made. At the things growing quietly without anyone watching them. She told her mother to stop, Evelyn said. "She drew a line. That matters to me." The afternoon moved around them, and somewhere in the main house, Nathaniel Whitmore was alone with a set of documents and the full knowledge of what had been built around him. And Clara Beaumont was in her room with the decision of her life sitting in front of her, and Harriet Beaumont was composing herself for whatever came next. Evelyn stayed in the garden. She pressed her palms flat on the warm stone wall and felt the solid weight of it. She had come here to be a shadow. She had told the truth instead, and now everything was in motion, not the controlled, arranged motion that Harriet Beaumont had planned, but the real kind. The kind that came from honesty, moving through a house like a storm. The kind you couldn't stop once it started, and couldn't predict and couldn't manage. The only thing she could do now was stay herself. It had gotten her this far. She stayed in the garden until Amos came to sit beside her knee, aching and unbothered, and they sat together while the afternoon light went long and gold across the Kentucky land, and neither of them said anything at all, and it was enough. Clara Beaumont came to find Evelyn before supper. She didn't knock the way most people knocked, that polite announcing tap that gave the person inside time to compose themselves. She knocked once firmly and opened the door before Evelyn had fully risen from the chair. She stood in the doorway of the east room and looked at the narrow bed and the single bag and the mended blue dress hanging on the hook by the window, and something moved across her face that she didn't try to hide. "I need to talk to you," Clara said. "Then come in," Evelyn said. Clara came in and closed the door and didn't sit. She stood in the center of the small room with her hands clasped in front of her and her back straight, and she looked at Evelyn with an expression that had shed every layer of social management. What was underneath was younger than Evelyn expected. Frightened in a way that had been practiced out of her public face so long, it looked strange to see it uncovered. "I know what my mother did," Clara said. "I know you know," Evelyn said. "I told her to stop." "I heard you." Clara's jaw tightened. "I didn't know about the ledger specifically. I knew she'd brought Calloway here for reasons she wouldn't tell me clearly. I knew it had something to do with the land records. I knew—" She stopped. "I knew it wasn't right." "But you didn't tell anyone," Evelyn said. "No," Clara said. "I didn't." The honesty of it landed between them. "She's my mother," Clara said, and for the first time her voice cracked at the edges. I know it isn't an excuse, but she's spent 20 years building everything around what she wanted for me, and I have let her because it was easier than fighting her, and because part of me believed that wanting the same things she wanted made it all right." She stopped, steadied herself. "It doesn't make it all right." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said. "It doesn't. I want to tell Nathaniel what I know," Clara said. "What I actually know, the conversations I heard, what Calloway told her, the name of the solicitor she'd been corresponding with about the boundary dispute. I want to give him everything." She paused. "But I need to know something first." "What?" "Did you tell him it was her?" Clara said. "Did you give him her name?" "I told him what I observed," Evelyn said. "Voices below my window. The method with the duplicate key. What you said to her in the dark. I didn't accuse her directly because I didn't have direct evidence." Clara absorbed this. "You protected her," she said slowly. "I told the truth as far as I knew it," Evelyn said. "That's different. Most people would have named her. Most people would have named her the moment it served them," Evelyn said. "I didn't name her because I didn't know it with certainty. That's all." Clara looked at her with an expression that was complicated and real and had no social calculation in it whatsoever. "I don't understand you," Clara said. "I'm not that complicated," Evelyn said. "You came here to be used," Clara said. "My mother arranged it that way deliberately. You knew it and you came anyway. You've been honest and decent and useful, and you haven't tried to make anyone look bad, even when they earned it." She stopped. "And now you're sitting in the smallest room in this house telling me you didn't name my mother because you weren't certain." "That's right," Evelyn said. "Why? Clara said. What do you get from that? Evelyn thought about it. The real answer, not the easy one. I get to be someone I can live with, she said. That's all I've got that isn't borrowed. Clara stood there in the center of the East Room, and the silence went long, and something changed in her face. Something settled. Something resolved. The way a decision looks when it stops being a decision and becomes simply the next thing a person does. I'm going to talk to Nathaniel, Clara said. Tonight. That's between you and him, Evelyn said. I know. Clara moved toward the door. Then she stopped. Evelyn? Yes. I wrote that note, she said. The one under your door. I stand by the warning, but not the way I meant it then. Evelyn waited. Be careful, Clara said. Not because of me. Because of what you're walking into. He's a good man. I think he genuinely is. But he has been managed by loss for a very long time, and good men who have been managed by loss can still hurt people without meaning to. She paused. Don't let him. Evelyn looked at her. Thank you, she said. Clara nodded once and left. Evelyn sat in the East Room for a long time after the door closed. She thought about what it cost Clara Beaumont to walk through that door. 20 years of her mother's plans. The thing she'd been prepared for her entire life. The practical argument that Harriet Beaumont had so carefully constructed. Clara was going to walk into Nathaniel Whitmore's office and dismantle her own position with her own hands because she'd drawn a line in the dark, and she was a woman who meant the lines she drew. Evelyn hadn't expected that. She thought she probably should have. The hairline crack in the hallway. That's why he's looking at you. The iron in Clara's voice when she'd told her mother to stop. She thought Clara Beaumont was prepared her whole life to be one thing, and tonight she was going to choose to be another. That was not a small thing. That was actually one of the bravest things Evelyn had seen since she'd arrived at this house. She went down to supper. The meal was quiet, in a way that had texture to it. Not peaceful quiet, but the quiet of people who knew something was happening and were waiting to find out what. Harriet Beaumont presided over the table with the precision of a woman in full control of herself, if nothing else. And she was gracious and warm and watchful, and her eyes moved to Clara twice, in a way that was meant to be subtle and wasn't. Clara ate her supper and looked at no one in particular. Nathaniel didn't come to supper. Afterward, when the women drifted to the parlor, Evelyn saw Clara go the other direction down the hall toward the estate office, walking steadily, her hands loose at her sides. Harriet saw it too. For one moment, Harriet Beaumont's composure showed its seams. She started to follow. Evelyn stepped slightly into the hallway. Not blocking, just present. Just there. Harriet stopped. They looked at each other. Mrs. Beaumont, Evelyn said quietly. Let her go. Harriet's expression was something she'd never let anyone see in a social gathering. All of it on the surface now, the fear and the calculation and the fury of a woman who had built something for 20 years and was watching it come apart and knew she'd brought it on herself. You have no idea, Harriet said very low, what I have sacrificed for my daughter. I think I do, Evelyn said. I think that's the problem. Harriet looked at her for one more moment. Then she turned and walked to the parlor, and her back was straight the whole way, and she sat down among the other women and accepted a cup of tea and said something about the weather clearing, and her hands were perfectly steady. Evelyn stood in the hall and breathed. She went to the East Room. She didn't sleep. She sat in the chair by the window and listened to the house settle into its night sounds and waited for she didn't know what. It came at nearly 11 o'clock. A knock at her door. Not Clara's knock. Different. She opened it. Nathaniel Whitmore stood in the hallway with a lamp and an expression that had been through something. I'm sorry for the hour, he said. Come in, she said, then caught herself. Wait in the hall. I'll get my shawl. She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders and came out, and they stood in the narrow hallway, him with the lamp, both of them quiet for a moment. Clara told me everything, he said. I know she was going to. She gave me the name of the solicitor, he said. The correspondence, the specific nature of what Calloway was hired to do. He stopped. It was thorough. It was more than I expected. Clara is more than most people expect, Evelyn said. He looked at her. You knew that. I suspected it, she said. Tonight confirmed it. He was quiet. Then, she also told me she wrote the note under your door. Evelyn said nothing. And that you didn't tell me, he said. No? Why? Because it wasn't relevant to finding your ledger, she said, and because she's not her mother. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight between them was warm and unsteady. Harriet Beaumont and the women she invited will be leaving tomorrow morning, he said. All of them. I've spoken with Preston about the arrangements. This process, whatever it was, is over. Something moved in her chest. All of them. All of them, he said. The words sat there. She understood what that meant. She was one of the women Harriet had invited. When the carriages left tomorrow morning, she would be in one of them. Back to Harlan County, back to her father's kitchen table, back to the bank letter and the 60 days that were still counting, and the thinning thread and the mended dress. I see, she said. Evelyn. No, she said gently. I understand. It's the right thing to do. The arrangement is compromised. Sending everyone home is sensible. I don't want to be sensible, he said, and his voice was rougher than she'd ever heard it. She looked at him. Clara told me something else, he said. She told me, she said. He stopped, pressed his hand against the wall. Started again. She said you asked for nothing, that you came here with nothing, and you've asked for nothing, and you've given honest information that cost you your own position, and you still asked for nothing. That's accurate, Evelyn said. Evelyn? He said her name like it was the only word in the sentence, and the sentence meant something he hadn't figured out how to put into language yet. I don't want to send you home. She looked at him steadily. But, she said, but I don't know how to. He stopped again, looked at the lamp, looked back at her. I have spent 12 years building walls because I couldn't trust my own judgment about people. And then you walked into my Southfield and told me my crops were dying and argued with my margin notes and sat in my library through a storm and told me the truth when it cost you something to tell it, and He went quiet. I don't know what I'm doing. Yes, you do, she said. He looked at her. You know exactly what you're doing, she said. You're just frightened of it. A beat of silence. Yes, he said, quietly. Just that. She looked at him in the lamplight, this man who had tripled an estate through precision and discipline, and the careful removal of everything that could hurt him, standing in a narrow hallway at 11 o'clock at night because he didn't want to do the sensible thing. She thought about Adelaide Prescott, about what Amos had said she'd always planned to leave him when it got hard, and he didn't know that until she went. She thought about what it meant to discover that someone had been near you without ever being with you, about how you rebuilt trust in yourself after that, about whether you rebuilt it alone or whether you needed someone real enough long enough that you had no choice but to believe them. She thought about what Clara had said. Don't let him hurt you without meaning to. She said, I need to tell you something. All right. I came here for money, she said. Not for you, not for the estate, not for the life, not for any romantic reason. My father owes a debt, and we have 60 days, and I had no better option. I want you to know that clearly. I don't want there to be a version of this where you think I came here pure and selfless, because I didn't. I came here out of necessity, and I made the best of it that I could. He nodded. I know. And I need you to know, she said, that everything I did after I arrived, every honest thing, every true thing that wasn't a strategy, that was just me. I don't know how to be anything else. I know that too, he said, and I need you to know, she said, third time, her voice steady and deliberate, that I will not be something you settle for. I will not be the sensible choice or the practical decision or the woman you chose because the arrangement with the other one fell apart. If you want me, it has to be because you want me, not because I was the last one standing." The hall was very quiet. Nathaniel Whitmore looked at her for a long time. "Evelyn Carter," he said. "I have met precisely one person in 12 years who told me the truth when it cost her something to tell. It argued with my margin notes, found my drainage problem, refused to name a woman who deserved to be named, and then stood in a hallway and told me she came here for money." He paused. "I want you, not the last one standing, you specifically, the person who did all of those things." She looked at him. Her heart was doing the complicated thing again, and she told it as she always did to be careful. But she let herself hear it. All of it. She let the words land where they were aimed. "All right," she said. He looked almost startled. "All right. Did you expect me to argue?" "Honestly," he said. "Yes. I argue when I disagree," she said. "I just told you everything I needed you to understand. You heard it. I don't have anything left to argue about." Something shifted in his face, that loosening, that breaking open she'd seen in the office, but fuller now, more complete. He looked like a man setting down something he'd been carrying for 12 years, and discovering his arms didn't know what to do without the weight. "There's still the matter of your father's debt," he said. "Yes," she said. "There is. I'd like to help with that," he said carefully. "Not as a condition, not as a price for anything, simply because it's the right thing to do and I have the means to do it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You understand," she said, "that I'm going to need time to figure out how to accept that without feeling like it changes what I just said." "Take all the time you need," he said. "It might be a while." "Evelyn," he said. "I waited 12 years to have a conversation like the one we had in the library. I think I can manage a while." She looked at him. She almost smiled. She held it back because some things were worth holding back, and because the moment was fragile in the way that real moments were fragile, and she didn't want to rush it. "Good night, Nathaniel," she said. "Good night, Evelyn." She went inside and closed the door and stood with her back against it, and breathed, and the East Room was exactly what it had always been. Narrow bed, single bag, mended dress on the hook, and everything in it felt completely different. She pressed her hands flat against the door behind her. She thought, stay yourself. Whatever comes next, stay yourself. She thought 60 days, his debt, the practical realities, all of it still real. She thought he said you specifically. Morning came with the noise of carriages being prepared. Evelyn was up before it was fully light. Dressed, her bag packed the same way. It had arrived. One bag, one mended dress. Everything else worn on her body. She brought the bag downstairs and set it with the others, and then went to the kitchen where Delia was making breakfast with the efficiently contained emotions of someone who had been told there would be a large departure and had feelings about it that she was not being paid to express. "Sit," Delia said, and put a plate in front of her. Evelyn sat and ate, and Delia moved around the kitchen, and after a while Delia said without looking at her, "You'll come back." "I don't know that," Evelyn said. "I do," Delia said with the certainty of a woman who had been reading households for 30 years. "That man didn't look at any of those other women the way he looks at you." She paused. "And I've been watching him for 11 years. Evelyn thought about what Amos had said about Nathaniel's mother. She thought about Margaret saying lonely with that simple finality. She thought about a man at first light on a horse checking drainage work, because when something mattered to him, he couldn't leave it to other people. She finished her breakfast and thanked Delia and went to the front of the house. The carriages were assembling. Women were coming down with their bags. The Hargrove cousins, the women from the outer counties, the others whose names she'd learned and would probably not see again. There was the particular social texture of a group that had been together for 3 weeks and was now dissolving the awkward warmth of people who had been thrown into close quarters and were reverting to their ordinary distances. Harriet Beaumont came down last. She was composed. completely flawlessly composed. She was dressed for travel, and she moved through the assembling carriages with the grace of a woman who had never intended to stay, who was leaving on her own terms, whose plans had simply taken a different shape than expected. She passed Evelyn without looking at her. Then she stopped. She turned. She looked at Evelyn with all the layers dropped, not in the hallway way of last night when she'd been shaken. This was different. This was the look of a woman who had steadied herself overnight and arrived at something. "You're better at this than I gave you credit for," Harriet said, quietly just between them. Evelyn looked at her. "I wasn't playing a game." "I know," Harriet said. "That's what I mean." She turned and walked to the carriage. Clara came out of the house last. She was dressed simply. Her bag was in her hand, and her mother was already in the first carriage, and she was walking toward the second, and she stopped when she reached Evelyn, and they stood together for a moment. "I told him everything," Clara said, "even the parts that reflected badly on me." "I know," Evelyn said. "That was brave." "It didn't feel brave," Clara said. "It felt like the only thing I could do that I'd be able to live with." Evelyn heard her own words from the night before come back to her. "Yes," she said, "that's what brave usually feels like." Clara looked at her. The young frightened thing underneath was still visible, but it had company now, something that looked like the beginning of the person Clara Beaumont was going to be when she stopped being her mother's project. "I hope things go well for you," Clara said. "I actually mean that." "I know," Evelyn said. "I actually believe it." Clara nodded once, held out her hand. Evelyn took it. They shook hands the way her father shook hands, firm and brief and meaning it. Clara got into the carriage. The carriages moved. Evelyn stood in the front yard and watched them go, and the dust settled, and the sound of wheels and horses faded, and then it was just the estate again. The summer morning sounds, the birds, the distant work of the farm, the ordinary living of the place. She turned. Nathaniel Whitmore was standing at the top of the front steps. Margaret was beside him, and Amos was somewhere behind her near the garden path, and Delia was in the kitchen window, and Preston was pretending to look at papers near the office door. All of them watching. Nathaniel came down the steps. He stopped in front of her. "Your carriage didn't leave," he said. "I noticed that," she said. "I took the liberty," he said, "of having your bag brought back inside." She looked at him. "That was presumptuous." "Yes," he said. "It was. I'm working on that." "Are you?" she said. "I'm told it's one of my less admirable qualities," he said. "Who told you that?" "Margaret," he said. "Just now, while you were watching the carriages." She glanced at Margaret, who had the expression of someone who had said nothing of the sort and was enjoying being credited for it. Evelyn looked back at Nathaniel. He was standing in the morning light with his hat in his hand, which she'd noticed he did. When he was uncertain, the hat came off his head and into his hands, and he held it there, and it was the most human thing about him. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as a guest, not as a candidate for anything. Just here, for a while, until we both figure out what we're actually doing." She looked at him. All the practical things were still true. The debt was still real. The 60 days were still counting. She was still a woman with one mended dress and a bag that had taken 10 minutes to pack because there wasn't more to put in it. She was also, she realized for the first time since she'd burned that letter 3 times in her father's kitchen, not afraid. Not because the practical things had resolved. They hadn't. Not because the future was clear. It wasn't. But because she was standing on solid ground, and the ground was herself, and she had not lost any of it, not a piece, not an edge in 3 weeks in a house that had tried in various ways to reduce her. She had told the truth. She had cost herself her position and told the truth anyway. She had said hard things to the right people at the right time. She had been kind to people who couldn't give her anything. She had not pretended to be less than she was, or more than she was, or anything other than exactly what she was. And she was still here. "All right," she said. Nathaniel exhaled. It was small and controlled, and she heard it anyway. "All right," he said. From the garden path, Amos made a small sound that was probably not a laugh. From the kitchen window, Delia had turned back to the stove, but her shoulders had the shape of someone smiling. Margaret Whitmore looked at the two of them from the top of the steps and said nothing, because she had earned the right to let other people arrive at their own conclusions without commentary. Nathaniel said, "I'd like to show you the rest of the land. The parts we haven't covered." "All of it," she said. "It's a large estate," he said. "That might take a while," she said. "Yes," he said, "it might." She picked up nothing, her bag was already back inside, and she walked with him toward the east field, the morning opening up ahead of them, the summer Kentucky land running wide and green and full of everything it still needed to be read. She didn't take his arm. But their steps matched, and neither of them adjusted to make it happen. It just did. And that, she thought, that easy, unforced matching of pace was the most honest thing that had happened at Whitmore Estate since she'd arrived. She let herself have it. Just that. Just the morning, and the land, and the man beside her who was learning to stop measuring things, and the solid ground of herself beneath her feet. Just that. For now, it was everything. They walked the east field that morning until the sun was high enough to mean it, and Nathaniel showed her the land the way a man shows something he loves, not with performance, not with the careful framing of someone trying to impress, but with the particular quiet pride of a person who has built something real and knows exactly what it cost. He showed her where the soil changed character at the ridgeline. He showed her the spring-fed section in the north corner that never went fully dry, even in a hard summer. He showed her the old fence line that marked where his grandfather's original 100 acres had ended, and where his father had expanded, and where he himself had added the last 3 parcels that made the estate what it was now. She asked questions. Real ones, not polite ones. He answered them fully, and twice she pushed back on something he said, and both times he considered her pushback with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely determining whether she was right. The second time she was. He told her so without qualification. She noted that quietly and filed it away as another true thing about him. They came back to the house at midday, and the house had a different quality, without the 11 women in it, quieter more itself, the rooms returning to their ordinary proportions. Delia had made a simple lunch and set 2 places at the small table in the side room, rather than the long formal dining room. And neither of them mentioned the adjustment. They just sat down and ate and talked about soil composition and the merits of early versus late planting, and whether the eastern expansion Nathaniel was considering would strain his labor capacity in the 3rd year. Margaret appeared at the end of the meal, sat down with her water, and listened to the conversation for a few minutes before saying, "You two are going to be insufferable to sit next to at dinner." Nathaniel looked at her. "I thought you liked agricultural discussion." "I like it fine," Margaret said. "I like it better when it occasionally pauses for something else." "Such as," Evelyn said. "Oh, I don't know," Margaret said. "The rest of human life." She stood up. "Preston needs you, Nathaniel. Something about the legal response to the boundary question." He pushed his chair back immediately. The boundary dispute wasn't resolved just because the ledger was back in its cabinet. Callaway might be gone, but the legal correspondence Harriet had set in motion was a document that existed in the world and would need to be answered properly. He paused at the door. "Will you be all right for a while?" He was asking her, not asking the room, not asking Margaret. Her. "I've been all right for 25 years, she said. "I think I can manage an afternoon." He almost smiled, went through the door. Margaret looked at Evelyn across the table with the frank assessment she never bothered to soften. "You know what happens next," she said. "I have a general idea," Evelyn said. "The county will talk," Margaret said. "They're already talking. 11 women came here, and 10 left and 1 stayed, and the one who stayed is Thomas Carter's daughter from Harlan County, with a mended dress and a father in debt, and people will say what people say." "Let them," Evelyn said. "Easy to say," Margaret said. "Harder to live." "I've been living it my whole life," Evelyn said. "Being the girl whose family lost their money. Being the girl who was passed over, looked through, arranged around. I've been the contrast in someone else's picture before this." She paused. "I know how to walk into a room when the room has already decided what I am?" Margaret looked at her. "Yes," the old woman said finally. "I believe you do." She left Evelyn at the table. Evelyn sat for a moment longer. Then she went upstairs, got her shawl, and went to find Amos. He was in the East Garden, because he was always in the East Garden, moving at the pace his knee allowed, and no faster, working with the patient steadiness of a man who had made peace with time. She sat on the stone wall and watched him work. After a while he said, "You're still here." "Apparently," she said. He nodded as if this confirmed something he'd known. "You going to write to your father?" She had been thinking about that. The letter she needed to write, how to explain what exactly, that she had come here to be used as a backdrop and had somehow ended up staying. That the man at the center of the arrangement had sent everyone else home. That the debt was, she didn't know yet. She didn't know the shape of what Nathaniel had meant or what she was willing to accept or how to hold those two things in balance. "I need to write to him," she said. "I don't quite know what to say yet." "Tell him you're safe," Amos said. "Start there. Everything else can come after." She thought about her father's face across the kitchen table, the bank letter aligned with the edge, his hands holding themselves still. "He'll worry," she said. "He's already worrying," Amos said. "A letter saying you're safe won't make it worse." She went inside and wrote the letter. She kept it simple, the way Amos had suggested. "I am safe. I am well. Things have changed here in ways I will explain better when I am able. Please don't worry. I am still myself." She sealed it and gave it to Preston to arrange the post, and then she stood in the administrative hallway, feeling the particular weight of having done the necessary thing, without knowing whether it was the right thing. She was still standing there when Preston came out of the estate office, closed the door carefully behind him, and said, "Miss Carter?" "Mr. Preston." He had the expression of a man who had decided to say something difficult and was going to say it before he changed his mind. "I owe you an apology," he said. "When the ledger went missing the direction of my thinking, I should not have—" "You didn't accuse me directly," she said. "My thinking moved in a direction that wasn't warranted," he said. "Given your position in the house, it was an easy assumption and not a fair one. I'd like to say so plainly." She looked at him. Preston was a careful, narrow, precise man who ran this estate with the same disciplined efficiency that Nathaniel brought to the land itself. He was not a man who said things plainly unless he'd decided plainness was owed. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate it." He nodded, brisk, relieved to have it done. "The post will go out tomorrow morning. Your letter will make Harlan County by the end of the week." He went back to his work. She stood in the hall and thought about assumptions. About the direction thinking moved when a woman had a mended dress and a room at the back of the house. About how fast a person could be read and filed and decided about by people who hadn't taken the time to look. She thought about how long she'd been living inside other people's assumptions, and whether here in this house, in this new configuration, that was going to be different. She didn't know yet, but Preston had apologized. Without prompting. With plainness. That was something. She went to find the book with Nathaniel's margin notes and read for the rest of the afternoon. 3 days passed. They established a rhythm without deciding to the way rhythms established themselves when people were paying attention to the actual texture of time rather than the performance of it. Mornings they walked the land, or she worked with Amos, or she read in the library, and sometimes Nathaniel found her there, and sometimes he didn't, and either way was fine. Afternoons he worked with Preston on the legal matter and the estate accounts, and she kept herself useful in ways that were natural and unforced, helping Delia with the inventory, talking with old Amos about the rose plantings, finding a better system for the seed storage in the east barn that Preston implemented with the same careful brevity with which he'd apologized. She was not performing a role. She was not executing a strategy. She was just living at Whitmore Estate and being useful where she could and honest where she needed to be, and the house seemed to breathe more easily around her, and she thought that was probably the most honest measure of whether she belonged somewhere. On the third evening, Nathaniel came to find her in the library at the end of his working day. She looked up. He had the expression of someone who had spent the day inside difficult work and come through it, and was now standing at the other end of it, needing to be somewhere real. He sat in the chair across from her without ceremony. They talked for 2 hours, not about the land this time, about everything else. About his father, who had been a hard man with genuine love in him that he didn't always know how to express, and about how Nathaniel had spent years confusing the hardness with the love and trying to sort out which was which. About her mother, who had taught her the folk tune she'd played in the parlor, and who had been dead 6 years now, and whose absence still showed up in unexpected places, the way she reached for someone to ask when she wasn't sure of something, and there was no one there. About what it meant to inherit a failing thing versus building something from nothing, and which was harder. About the winter the horses died, and what her father had said that morning, which was nothing. Just put his hand on her shoulder and stood there, and how that was sometimes more than words. She told him about the letter she'd written. He asked about her father. She told him about Thomas Carter, honestly, his warmth and his stubbornness, and his terrible instinct for trusting the wrong people financially, and his absolute bedrock decency in everything else. She told him about the debt without softening it, the way she'd always told him everything, and he listened with the focused attention that she'd come to understand was his way of caring about something. "I want to help with it," he said when she was done. "I told you that. The offer stands." "I know," she said. "And you're still working out how to accept it." "I'm working out," she said carefully, "what accepting it means. There's a version of accepting it that feels like receiving charity. There's a version that feels like a transaction money for a future consideration. There's a version that's just someone doing a right thing because they have the means and the will." She paused. "I need to know which version you mean before I know whether I can take it." He looked at her for a long moment. "The third one," he said. "Just that. No conditions," she said. "No conditions. Not implied ones either," she said. "Not the kind that aren't said but exist anyway." "Evelyn," he said, "if I wanted conditions, I'd have stated them. I don't have implied terms. What I say is what I mean." She looked at him. She believed him. That was the thing, she actually believed him, not because she was inclined toward belief, not because she wanted it to be true, but because 12 days of watching this man had shown her that his words and his actions came from the same place. He had burned his notes. He had told the truth about the arrangement. He had sent Harriet home. He had brought Evelyn's bag back inside. He did what he said. "All right," she said. "Then I accept." He nodded. The nod was the same as the one across the breakfast table all those days ago, small, direct, meaning it. "I'll have Preston arrange it this week," he said. "The full amount delivered to your father's bank directly. No fanfare." "No fanfare," she agreed. A pause. "Nathaniel," she said, "I want to be clear about something." "I expect nothing less," he said with the dryness that she'd learned was as close to humor as he usually got, and which she found she liked very much. "My accepting this doesn't change what I said in the hallway," she said. "I'm not going to feel obligated. I'm not going to feel like this buys anything. If things between us go somewhere, it's because they go there on their own merits. If they don't, then you helped a good man keep his farm, and that's what it is." He looked at her with that open, unguarded quality that still surprised her every time she saw it, because it was so different from the face he showed the world. "I wouldn't want it any other way," he said. She believed that too. The letter reached her father faster than Preston had predicted, 5 days, rather than 7, something to do with the post-rider's route that week. She knew it had arrived because on the 6th morning, a return letter came for her, and Delia brought it up with breakfast, and Evelyn's hands were slightly unsteady when she opened it. Her father's handwriting, big and cramped and slightly slanted because he'd never been formally schooled and had taught himself late. "Evelyn, I am glad you are safe. I am not going to ask questions you're not ready to answer. I trust you. I always have. Come home when you can. Whatever happens, come home." She sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about going home, about what home was now, the house with the thinning thread, and the bank letter on the table, and her father's face that looked more lined every year. About whether home was a place or a person, or the version of yourself that still existed when everything else was stripped away. She thought she knew the answer. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket and went downstairs, and Nathaniel was in the front hall with his hat in his hand, which meant he was uncertain about something. She stopped. "What?" she said. "I need to go to Lexington," he said. "The solicitor handling the boundary matter has requested a meeting. It'll take 3 days, maybe 4. He paused. "I'd like you to come." She looked at him. "As what?" she said. Not challenging, just clear. He held her gaze. "As yourself," he said. "As the person I want beside me when I'm dealing with something difficult." She thought about what that meant, about what it would look like in Lexington in 1817 for Nathaniel Whitmore to arrive with Evelyn Carter at his side, about what the solicitor would think, about what the county would say. She thought about Margaret's words. Easy to say, harder to live. She thought, I have been the contrast in someone else's picture. I have been the shadow. I have been the girl who lost everything and came to be used as a backdrop and stayed to tell the truth. I have not yet been the person someone chose to stand beside. "When do we leave?" she said. The ride to Lexington took most of a day, and they talked for most of it, not about the legal matter, not about the estate, but about the kind of things that came up when two people had decided to stop managing each other and just be present. He told her about the book he'd read 3 times and still wasn't sure he agreed with. She told him about the winter she'd spent reading every agricultural text she could get her hands on, because there was nothing else to do, and she needed to feel like she was doing something. He told her about the one time he'd played cards in a tavern in Louisville and won an amount of money that embarrassed him, and lost it all again, deliberately, because he didn't feel right about taking it. She told him about the time she'd said something honest to a woman at Sunday service that had not been received well and had resulted in 6 months of being carefully excluded from every social gathering in the county, and how she'd spent those 6 months deciding it had been worth it. "Was it?" he said. "Yes," she said. She needed to hear it. "But it cost you." "Things that matter usually do," she said. He looked at her across the carriage. "I think," he said slowly, "that you've been paying costs your whole life that other people didn't notice." She thought about that. "I think most people do," she said. "The difference is just whether you end up bitter about it." "And you're not." "Not yet," she said. "Check back with me in another 25 years. He almost laughed. It was closer than she'd gotten before, and she tucked that away too. The meeting with the solicitor in Lexington was 2 hours of careful legal language and the particular tense focus of men discussing land in precise terms, and Evelyn sat and listened and said nothing until the solicitor made an assumption about the north boundary that she knew was wrong based on the land records she'd seen, and then she said so. Both men looked at her. "The survey you're referencing was conducted in 1803, she said, "before the creek shifted in the flood of 1808. The current north boundary is established by the 1812 resurvey, which supersedes the earlier document. Mr. Whitmore's records show this clearly." A silence. The solicitor looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Evelyn. Then he looked back at the solicitor. "She's right," he said. "Do you have the 1812 survey?" The solicitor did not have the 1812 survey. He sent his clerk out for it, and they waited. And while they waited, the solicitor looked at Evelyn with the recalibrating expression she had learned to recognize the one that meant someone was adjusting their category for her in real time. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "you are familiar with the Whitmore land records?" "I've read them," she said. "Mr. Whitmore showed me the estate library." "I see," he said, in a tone that meant something he wasn't quite saying. Nathaniel said quietly, but with complete clarity, "Miss Carter has been invaluable in identifying several issues with the estate that my own staff had missed. I'd ask you to take her observations seriously." The solicitor nodded, adjusted, moved on. The clerk came back with the 1812 survey. Evelyn was right. They resolved the boundary matter in the next hour, and when they walked out of the solicitor's office into the afternoon, Nathaniel stopped on the step and turned to her. "How did you know about the 1812 resurvey?" he said. "I read everything in your library," she said, "including the land history files. You had them shelved with the agricultural texts, which is where I would have put them too." He looked at her. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes, I'd like to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know before I ask it that the answer, whatever it is, doesn't change what I've already done or what I intend to do. This is not a condition or a transaction or an implication." Her heart did the complicated thing. She looked at him steadily. "Ask," she said. He held his hat in both hands. The afternoon around them was warm and ordinary, and full of the sounds of a working Kentucky town horses, voices, the distant ring of a smith's hammer. "I would like to court you," he said, "properly, with your father's knowledge and your own consent, and nothing hidden about the intention." He paused. "I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm asking if you'll let me ask." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the East Room, the narrow bed, the mended dress on the hook, the bank letter aligned with the edge of the kitchen table. 60 days which had been running while she was at Whitmore Estate, and which were now, she did the arithmetic in her head, down to fewer than 20. She thought about a man who burned his notes and checked his drainage work at first light, and almost laughed once in a carriage and held his hat when he was uncertain about something. She thought about her father's letter. "I trust you. I always have." She thought about what she'd told Nathaniel in the hallway. "If you want me, it has to be because you want me." And she thought about what he'd said back. "You specifically." "Yes," she said. "You may ask." He exhaled, and she heard it, and she looked at the hat in his hands and thought, "This is a real person. This is what a real person looks like when they stop managing themselves." "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I'm not easy." "I know," he said. "I figured that out around the time you told me the field was dying." She looked at him. And this time she let herself smile. Not the small held-back version, the real one, brief and genuine and entirely her own. He looked at her like it was the first time he'd seen something he hadn't known he'd been waiting for. They went back to the estate. The days that followed had a different quality. Not easier exactly, the practical matters were still present, real and requiring attention. Nathaniel had Preston deliver the payment to her father's bank at the end of the week, no fanfare exactly as promised, and her father's letter in response was 3 lines received. "Thank God. Come home when you're ready." She wrote back, "Soon. I promise. I'm all right." She was all right. She was more than all right, and she was careful about what that meant, because she had not come to Whitmore Estate looking for more than all right, and she did not want to mistake relief for something larger than it was. But she woke each morning knowing where she was, and she went to sleep each night having been herself throughout the day, and the ground was solid under her feet in a way it had not been for a long time. Margaret noticed, of course. Margaret noticed everything. She found Evelyn in the East Garden one morning, not with Amos this time, just by herself, sitting on the stone wall with her hands in her lap, and the summer morning working itself out around her. Margaret sat beside her without being asked. "You wrote to your father," Margaret said. "Yes." And he answered. "Yes." "Good," Margaret said. And then, "Nathaniel told me what he asked you in Lexington." Evelyn looked at her. "He asked my opinion," Margaret said. "Before he asked you. He came to me the night before we left and sat across from me at that table in the East Room and said, 'Grandmother, I think I know what I want, but I don't trust my own judgment about people anymore, and I need you to tell me if I'm wrong.'" Evelyn was very still. "What did you tell him?" she said. "I told him the truth," Margaret said. I told him that in 60 years of watching people I had seen very few who were what they appeared to be, and that you were one of them. She paused. I told him that the last person I'd seen with that quality was his mother. The garden was quiet. He cried, Margaret said. Flat Simple stated. Only a little. He turned away and he composed himself quickly because he's Nathaniel, but I saw it. Evelyn pressed her hands flat on the warm stone wall. You're telling me this, she said, because you want me to understand something. I'm telling you this, Margaret said, because you are going to spend some time wondering if he's sure, if it's real, if it'll hold when things get hard. And I want you to have this. I want you to remember that before he asked you, he came to an old woman at night and sat down and admitted he didn't trust himself and asked for help. She paused. That's not a man performing certainty. That's a man working toward it. Evelyn sat with that. The summer morning moved around them. He's going to ask me properly, Evelyn said. To marry him. Not today, not yet, but eventually. Yes, Margaret said. And I'm going to say yes, Evelyn said. Not a question. Not uncertain. Just the truth stated clearly to the one person in this house she could say it to first. Margaret put her hand over Evelyn's on the stone wall. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. He asked on a Tuesday in late August. Not formally, not with ceremony or a gathering or the performance of occasion. He came to find her in the East Garden, where she was helping Amos with the fall preparation, and he stood there for a moment while Amos quietly took himself elsewhere with the patience of a man who had been watching this coming for weeks. Nathaniel didn't have his hat this time. His hands were at his sides and his face was open in the way it had learned to be still, not easy, still not without effort, but real. Evelyn, he said. She straightened up, brushed the soil off her hands. I know, she said. He looked at her. I know what you're going to ask, she said. And the answer is yes. You didn't let me ask, he said. You've been working up to it for 3 weeks, she said. I've been watching. I wanted to do it properly, he said. Then ask properly, she said. I'll still say yes. He took a breath, looked at her with every wall down, everything managed set aside the full weight of a man who had been alone for 12 years and had finally decided that was a choice he was no longer willing to make. Will you marry me, Evelyn Carter? He said. Not for what you bring to this estate, not for what you know about soil or land records or drainage problems, not for anything practical at all. Because you are the only person who has ever made me feel like the truth was worth telling. Because when you look at me, I believe I'm actually being seen. Because I don't want to keep living at the edge of my own life. He stopped. Will you? She looked at him. She thought about a burned letter and a narrow bed and a mended dress and a father's hands holding themselves still at a kitchen table. She thought about an old man with a bad knee who had told the truth to someone who asked. She thought about a woman who had drawn a line in the dark and meant it. She thought about 31 years of watching and waiting and tending and hoping something went right. She thought about herself, the version of herself that had walked into this house knowing she was a shadow and had refused every single day to be one. Yes, she said. Nathaniel Whitmore, I will marry you. He stepped forward and took her hands in both of his. Careful, certain the way he did everything that mattered. And they stood in the East Garden in the late August morning, with the Kentucky summer going golden around them. And neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was nothing left to say that their hands weren't already saying. From somewhere behind the rose beds, Amos made a sound that was definitely a laugh this time. They got married in October when the heat had broken and the harvest was in, and the land had given everything it had for the season and was resting. The ceremony was small, the house the people of the house. Thomas Carter, making the journey from Harlan County, with his good coat brushed, and his eyes bright with the particular brightness of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and has finally set it down. He shook Nathaniel Whitmore's hand in the front hall and said, "Take care of her." And Nathaniel said, She takes care of herself. I just intend to be worth her while." Thomas Carter looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled the wide, real smile that Evelyn had been seeing her whole life, the one that meant her father had decided something was true. "All right," he said. "Good." Evelyn, watching from across the hall, felt something complete inside her chest, a circle closing. Something finished that had been open and fraying at the edges for years. Her father's smile. This house. The person she had remained through all of it. The ceremony was performed by the local minister, who was brief and sincere and slightly awed to be inside Whitmore Estate, and Margaret Whitmore sat in the front, with the expression of a woman who had seen enough human foolishness to appreciate it when something went right, and Amos was in the back with his knee, and his quiet satisfaction, and Delia cried, which she would deny to anyone who brought it up, and Preston stood very straight and applauded with the precise correctness of a man who had adjusted his categories significantly over the past 2 months. After there was food and warmth and the sound of people being genuinely happy, which was different from the sound of people performing happiness, and Evelyn sat beside her husband at the table. Her husband. The words still new and slightly astonishing, and she thought about everything that had been required to get from the kitchen table in Harlan County to this chair. The burned letter. The decision made over scorched paper with her hand pressed flat. The East Room. The narrow bed. The mended dress. The south field and the yellowing leaves. The library in the storm. The night Harriet Beaumont arranged a scheme and Clara Beaumont undid it, and a duplicate key was found, and a man burned his margin notes and told the truth in a hallway. All of it, every uncomfortable, undignified, frightening piece of it, had been required. She had not been rescued. She had not been chosen from above by someone generous enough to look past her situation. She had walked into a house as a shadow, and she had been herself every single day at considerable cost, because she had not known how to be anything else, and that refusal to be less than herself had changed everything. Later, when the guests had thinned, and the house had quieted to its evening sounds, Nathaniel found her in the east garden. She was sitting on the stone wall where she'd sat with Amos and Margaret and herself, and the October air was cool on her face, and the stars were very clear. He sat beside her. They were quiet for a while, in the way they'd learned to be quiet companionably, without effort, each one present, and not requiring the other to fill the air. "Are you happy?" he said. She thought about the word, the real weight of it. "Yes," she said. "I am." "Good," he said. She looked at him. "Are you?" He looked at her back. And Nathaniel Whitmore, who had spent 12 years building walls and measuring people and managing loss with discipline and precision, who had come to a woman he didn't deserve, and asked her plainly, and been answered plainly, and was sitting now beside her in the garden of his own estate on the night of his own wedding, he smiled. Not the almost smile, not the brief, unguarded flash, a real one, full and steady, and completely his. "Yes," he said. She leaned her shoulder against his. He stayed, and that was the truth of it. Not a grand gesture, not a rescue, not the kind of story that needed to be made larger than it was. Just two people who had decided to stop managing their lives from the outside in and start living them from the inside out. Just a woman who had refused to be a shadow, and a man who had learned to stop measuring things sitting shoulder to shoulder in a garden in October with the harvest in and the debt paid and the land solid under their feet. That was all. That was everything. Sometimes the person who arrives with the least is the one who has the most to give, and the only currency she ever spent was the truth, and it built something that would last.